Our top story this hour, shuttle diplomacy at all levels to defuse the growing hostility between Russia and the West over Ukraine conflict seems to be failing. Even at the highest levels, US President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin held a telephonic conversation for over an hour. But the talks between the two presidents failed to ease tensions. During the call, US President Joe Biden insisted that Russia will face swift and severe costs if Russian troops carry out an invasion, and that such a step would produce widespread suffering and isolate Moscow. Washington says that the call between the two leaders has brought no major change in the Ukraine standoff. A White House statement has said that the United States remains prepared to engage in diplomacy and is also prepared for other scenarios. Both leaders, however, have agreed to continue dialogue. Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin also discussed United States and NATO response to Moscow's proposals on long-term international legal guarantees on Russia's security. Russia is seeking binding security guarantees from the West that include a pledge to roll NATO forces out of Eastern Europe and to never expand into Ukraine. Washington flatly rejected these demands, offered talks on a new European disarmament agreement with Moscow. Kremlin said that Russian president told his US counterpart that Washington has failed to take Russia's main concerns into account here and that it had received no substantial answer on the key issues: NATO's expansion and deployment of forces in Ukraine. Call between the two leaders came hours after the White House said that Russia could carry out an invasion into Ukraine any day now, even before the end of Beijing Winter Olympics. Washington's warning of an all-out Russian invasion any day intensified weeks of tensions between Russia and the West. Following a frenzy of telephone diplomacy, Kremlin in a statement denounced Washington's statements, calling it peak hysteria. French President Emmanuel Macron too spoke to both Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in an attempt to defuse tensions, countering United States warnings over an invasion. The French presidency said that there were no indications from what Putin told Macron that Russia is preparing an offensive against Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is also due to travel to Kiev on Monday and then visit Putin as European leaders strive to keep lines of communication open with Moscow. Scholz had earlier added his voice to European pledges to punish Russia with severe sanctions targeting its financial and energy sector if it invades Ukraine.
Muss mit der vollen Härte des Rechtsstaates sein.
And for more insight on the conflict that has caught the world's rapt attention, we are now being joined live by William Perry, fellow Stanford University for Brookings, Steve Pfeiffer, who is an analyst on the Ukrainian and Russian military arsenal. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Stephen Pfeiffer. Russian president has called Western claims of an imminent Russian invasion provocative speculation amid crisis talks with his US counterpart Joe Biden. How do you assess the talks between the two leaders?
Well, I think there's an effort in the West to try to keep the possibility of a dialogue going. But thus far, Russia has not taken up the American and the NATO counter proposals. And at the same time, this military buildup around Ukraine continues.
Right. US President Joe Biden has also reiterated that they remain committed to diplomacy, but they have warned of a response in case of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, also warning that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will not go ahead. What do you think is the way forward from this impasse?
Well, I would like to see the Russians make a decision to engage on a real dialogue to defuse the crisis. And the first step, of course, would be to de-escalate the military situation around Ukraine. As you said, Russia has made two key demands: that NATO never enlarge further and that NATO withdraw forces from the territory of allies who joined the alliance after 1997. NATO's been very clear it's not going to do that, but NATO and the United States do believe they could address Russian concerns through a combination of arms control measures, risk reduction steps, and confidence and security building measures, which could do real things for security in Europe. But thus far, the Russians are not prepared to engage onto those steps.
Right. Ms. Pfeiffer, that would be ideal, but diplomacy has failed to yield any results up until now. But what could be the next move from both Russia and the West in the days to come on ground?
Well, I think that you'll have Chancellor Scholz going to Moscow on Tuesday. I think that the West is ready to have some kind of a dialogue, but every time the Russians respond to the American and the NATO proposals, they say, They've only addressed our secondary concerns, not the main issues. And again, the main issues are really a little bit hard to understand from Russia. For example, Russia knows that there's no near or midterm prospect of NATO being invited to join NATO. It's a false issue. And although the Kremlin has tried to frame this crisis as a crisis between NATO and Russia and about NATO enlargement, the last country, the last NATO member that borders Russia joined the alliance 18 years ago in 2004. So why are we having this crisis now? I believe it's much more about the Kremlin's fear that they're about to lose Ukraine forever, and that's because of Russian policy of the last 8 years, the seizure of Crimea, and then this conflict that the Russians support in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, which has killed more than 14,000. That's pushed Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West.
Right. Also, just for more clarity on this, I know you touched on this earlier, how do you assess the warnings by the United States also asking their citizens to leave Ukraine immediately?
That's a major step. I mean, the National Security Advisor on Friday said the United States now sees a significant risk of a major Russian military action against Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, the American embassy asked dependents to leave, and they gave non-essential personnel the chance to leave. They're now saying, all Americans, you need to leave now, because if a conflict starts, the sorts of ways to get out of Ukraine, commercial air, train, may not be available. So I take this as a sign that the U.S. government thinks that there's a strong possibility, if not a probability, of Russian military action against Ukraine in the next several days.
All right. Mr. Stephen Pfeiffer, thank you so much for joining us with all your inputs on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.